Hello there, welcome back to Gaurav Tutorials, and in this video we will be discussing about biomolecule, a class of biomolecule, that is carbohydrates. Now technically carbohydrates are the organic compounds which contain carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. Here the hydrogen and the oxygen are in the ratio of 2:1. That is generally that's how we find water, right? You have two hydrogen over one oxygen in the structure of the water. Similar to that, in the carbohydrates also you'll have the ratio of hydrogen and oxygen as 2:1. Therefore the general formula for the carbon can be written as CH2ON. Okay, or you can write it as CnH2ON, right? N here is the number of the carbon, right? Now when we actually observe or talk about the carbohydrate, the term carbohydrate have come, like it has come from the French term hydrate de carbon. Hydrate de carbon, which means hydrate of carbon. Hydrate again is hydrogen and oxygen, so hydrate of carbon, right? Now in particular, when you talk about the carbohydrates are polyhydroxy. I call it polyhydroxy because it contains a lot of hydroxyl group. Okay, polyhydroxy aldoses, ketones, in fact ketose, yeah, this is ketose, and condensation products. So carbohydrates are the polyhydroxy aldoses, ketoses and condensation products, right? Now the aldose sugars are those sugar which has a terminal aldehyde or terminal CHO group, right? They have a terminal CHO group, whereas ketones are those carbohydrates which will have terminal, just a minute, yeah, they will have a terminal ketone group, CO group, right? Few example of these aldose and ketose sugars, if we were to write, for aldose we can write glyceraldehyde, we can write xylose, then there is ribose, there's glucose, among few. Similarly, if we were to write few examples of ketose, we can write dihydroxyacetone, there is erythrolose, just a minute, erythrulose, there is ribulose, there is xylulose, and then there is fructose. So these are few example of aldose sugars, and these are few example of ketose sugars, right? Now the carbohydrates are a major photosynthetic product. Carbohydrates are major photosynthetic products, and therefore approximately 80% of dry weight of plant is nothing but carbohydrates. It's nothing but carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are also called as, they are also referred to as saccharides. The term saccharides have been derived from a Greek word which is saccharine. It means sugar. All right. Now carbohydrates can be of two types. I'll just write it down here. Carbohydrates can be of two types. They can be a small carbohydrate, or there could be a large, or you can actually refer to it as a complex carbohydrate. Now these smaller carbohydrates or the small sugars are technically soluble in water, right? They are soluble in water. They are soluble and have low molecular weight. They are soluble and they have low molecular weight, right? Now these happens to be the smaller carbohydrates are sweet in nature, and therefore as they are sweet in nature, we will be actually calling them as sugar, right? The smaller carbohydrates can be further divided into monosaccharides, derived monosaccharides, or oligosaccharides. The larger one or the complex ones are referred to as polysaccharides, right? They'll be polysaccharide. See, smaller one, you can call them as, I'll just write it down here. You can call them as monosaccharide. You can also refer to them as derived monosaccharides, or you can call them as oligosaccharides. I mean there'll be different classes of these smaller one. There'll be one class called as monosaccharide. There'll be the class which will be called as derived monosaccharide, and then there'll be this class of smaller carbohydrate called as oligosaccharides. So the major focus in this video today, we will be actually talking about the smaller carbohydrates in this video, and that too the monosaccharides. All right, so let's shift our views. Let's talk about the monosaccharides. Monosaccharides are simple sugars, and they cannot be hydrolyzed further. They cannot be hydrolyzed into any smaller component. They cannot be hydrolyzed into smaller components. Oh, if you have got a long chain of sugar, so there's these sugars coming together and forming a long chain. Each of these will be a monosaccharide. So that's a monosaccharide bonding with this another monosaccharide. Then there's this thing. So what we are going to do is we will hydrolyze them, and we go on hydrolyzing them. What do we get? We get these independent units, and each of these independent units that you get upon hydrolysis of this longer chain of the sugar is a monosaccharide. And if you were to hydrolyze them, there's nothing else gonna come up, right? That's the last thing that you will get up when you end up hydrolyzing a long chain of the sugars, right? So that's your monosaccharide that cannot be hydrolyzed any further. They have a general formula of CnH2nO, where N is the number of the carbon, right? Now, depending on the number of the carbon that this monosaccharides would have, you could have different categories of these monosaccharides. First of them is triose. Now, as the name suggests, it has 3 carbons. Okay, it has got how many carbons? As the name suggests, it has got 3 carbon. Okay, few example of this triose sugar can be written as glyceraldehyde. Just a minute, yeah. Glyceraldehyde. The other example of the triose sugar, as far as I remember, is dihydroxyacetone. There's another category of the monosaccharides. It's called as tetrose. Tetrose means how many carbons? There'll be 4 carbon in this structure. A few example of this tetrose sugar would be, first of them is erythrose, and then there is threose. Just a minute. Yeah, there you go. Threose. There's another category of the monosaccharides. It's called as pentose, right? You have got, till now you got 3 categories: triose, tetrose, and pentose. The name suggests us that there'll be how many carbons? There'll be 5 carbons. Few examples: pentose, you might have heard ribose. You would have also heard this deoxyribose. Both of them are present as sugar in DNA and RNA, right? Moving forward, there's another class. It's called as hexose. How many carbons? There'll be 6 carbons. All right, few example of hexose sugar. Yeah, think. Are you reminded of any hexose sugar? Yeah, glucose. Then there is one starting with F. It's fructose, right? It's fructose. Excuse me. There's galactose, and then there is mannose as well. All right, I'll write those also. There's galactose, and then there is mannose. All right. Also, one more class of this monosaccharide is heptose sugar. Heptose means how many carbon? There'll be 7 carbon. Few examples of these heptose sugar. There is glucoheptose, and pseudoheptulose. Right? Okay. Now, what can these monosaccharides do is this aldose as well as the ketose sugar can do is they can have a tendency to form a bond with one another. These monosaccharides can form bonds with one another. So there is a long chain of these monosaccharides coming together to form a polymer, and in this case this becomes our monomer. This is another monomer, both of them coming together, and they'll form a dimer. Similarly, if you add one more sugar to this thing, one more monosaccharide, this becomes a trimer. Each of these are your monomers. All right, you add one more monomer to this becomes a tetramer, and that way if you go on adding new polymer, tetramer, just a minute, tetramer, you go on adding these molecules, you go on adding this sugar onto this thing and make a long chain, it becomes a polymer. Right, it becomes a polymer. So what can happen when a sugar binds to the other sugar? It forms a bond here. All these bonds that you see being formed between these sugar molecules are called as glycosidic bonds. These are called as glycosidic bonds, the bonds which hold these sugars together in a chain. All right. So the glycosidic bond can be between sugars. Now we have already seen in the earlier half of the video that the sugars are basically the small carbohydrates which are soluble and have a low molecular weight, and sweets, I mean they have sweet taste. Also, they can be the sugar can actually form a bond with the alcoholic group, or it can also form the bond with nitrogen group. It can form the bond with the alcoholic group or the nitrogen group of some different organic compound. Right. Now, this pentose and hexose are of great interest. Right. The pentose and the hexoses are of great interest to us. Now, why is this way? Why is this that we are so much interested in this pentose and the hexose? It's because these pentose and the hexose sugar can have two forms. They can have open form, that is, they'll have a linear structure, or they could have a closed form, or you can actually refer to it as a ring form. Right? You could have these pentose in this manner, arranged in a linear fashion. That's a pentose sugar. Then coming here, it's a hexose sugar. That's a linear structure. Right? If you were to talk about this ring structure, they can have shape like this. right? They could have a ring structure, or they could have a ring structure, or they could have a open structure, right? That's a hexagon. Just a minute. Yeah, that's a hexagon, and that becomes your pentagon, right? So pentos and hexos are of great importance to us, right? Now the rings that are formed by them are the pyranose ring and furanose ring. So you got this hexagon structure. That's your pyranose ring. That's your pyranose ring, and the pentagon one will be called as furanose ring. So there are pyranose ring and there are furanose ring. The pyranose rings are the structures where you'll have a hexagon shape, and the furanose are those structure where you'll have yeah, pentagon shape. In a typical furanose, you will find the ring will have 1, 2, 3, that's 4 carbon. Just a minute. Yeah, it will have 4 carbon in the ring, and then there will be this oxygen. Just a minute. Yeah, you'll have an oxygen here. Okay, here you might have another carbon. That's your furanose ring. Okay, coming to the pyranose ring, right? Coming to the pyranose ring, what will you find in this case is a structure like this. In fact, let me turn it other way. It's actually fine. Yeah, here let's talk about this this pyranose ring. In fact, actually leave it for time being. We'll actually make a good one, and then we'll study. Okay, now when you talk about a pyranose ring, let's make it properly. You got an oxygen molecule here. That's 1 carbon. That's 2nd carbon. Then you got 3rd, and then you got this 4th carbon. That's your C. Okay, that is a furanose ring, right? That's a furanose ring. When you talk about the pyranose ring, that's your O. That's your carbon. There's another carbon, 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 carbon. All right. What about number? That's your 1st carbon. That's your 2nd. That's your 3rd. That's your 4th carbon. Then this is the 5th carbon, and there goes the 6th carbon. Again here, that's the 1st carbon, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th, and the 5th carbon. Right. So that's how a furanose and a pyranose ring would look like. Right. Both of these pyranose as well as the furanose will actually occur in 2 forms. Right. Both of these, the furanose and the pyranose, will occur in 2 forms. There will be an alpha form, and then there will be a beta form. There'll be an alpha form, and then there'll be a beta form. So what the hell is this alpha and a beta form now? What is this alpha form and the beta form? Right. So if you talk about this, just a minute. What's an alpha form? Okay, first let's write it down in this notes of ours. What's an alpha form? When the oxygen, right? When the hydroxyl group, okay, if it's written below, okay, if it's written below the carbon, you'll have a alpha form. If it's written above the carbon, near the hydroxyl group, okay, near hydroxyl group is written below the carbon, and if it is written above the carbon, it becomes your beta form. But where near the oxygen atom, so let's talk about this alpha and the beta form. Even in the pyranose ring, this is your alpha ring form of this pyranose. Okay, it's actually your glucose. This is the structure of the glucose, and this here is your ribose sugar. This is your ribose sugar, right? Okay, now what are we going to find is this is your hydrogen, that's OH. Then this is hydrogen, that's OH. Then you have got OH, H, H, OH, and this goes as your CH2OH. Now, the first positioned carbon, here you find the hydroxyl group is written below, and therefore it turns out to be a alpha form of carbon. I mean alpha form of glucose. Okay, it's an alpha form of glucose. Okay, now come back to this, coming to the ribose. Coming to the ribose, you find here that's your OH. Okay, here you get H, that's your OH. This is again H, and that goes as OH. This is the H, and that goes as CH2OH. Right, look at this first carbon. Look at this first carbon. You find this hydroxyl group above the carbon, right? It's written above the carbon, and therefore it becomes your what form? It becomes beta form. It becomes beta form. So there are two forms of this furanose and the pyranose ring. If at all the hydroxyl group is written above the carbon to the carbon which is near the oxygen. Okay, the carbon which is near the oxygen. Here you see this is the nearest carbon to this oxygen group, right? This carbon is nearest to the oxygen atom. So here if the hydroxyl group is written above it, it forms the beta form. And when you look at the structure of the glucose, you find the hydroxyl group is written below the carbon near the oxygen atom, and therefore this turns out to be a alpha form. Right? Is that understood? Okay, now I've told you that the pentose and the hexose can form open as well as a closed structure. That is they can have a linear as well as ring structure. Now carbon here we have seen it's actually ring structure. Okay, now let us draw its linear structure as well. So this is your first carbon, CH double bond O, then you go with CH OH, CH OH, CH OH, and that will be your H, then C, just a minute, H and OH. Right, this will be your first carbon, second carbon, third carbon, fourth, fifth and sixth. So that's your linear structure, and this one is your ring structure for the carbon, for the glucose. All right, coming to the ribose, this one here is your ring structure. Now if we were to make a linear structure, what would it be? This is a ribose sugar, and if you are able to recall, ribose is what type of sugar? It's a aldose sugar. So the terminal group here would be aldehyde, right? So CH double bonds O, C, and C, those are your 5 carbon, H, this will be your H, again H, OH and OH. Right, that's your linear structure for the ribose. All right, now this ribose has a structure pretty much similar to another pentose sugar. Let's draw that as well. This is your oxygen, this becomes your first carbon, this becomes your first carbon. You just tell me now what form of the sugar is. Okay, what is the form of sugar here? It's a alpha form or it's a beta form. Okay, so I'll write it down here. That's your OH, this is your H, that's your H, OH, and that's your H. Acha, first of all, you tell me what kind of sugar is this? This is an alpha formed sugar or that's a beta formed sugar? Look at this first position of the carbon. That's your first carbon, that's your second, that's your third, and the fourth and the fifth carbon. Yeah. What form of sugar is this? Yeah, that's absolutely true. That's a beta sugar. Now, if you look at the second carbon, you find the hydroxyl group is absent here. Okay, oxygen is absent, you only have H here. Therefore, this group, this sugar will be called as deoxy, because it's lacking oxygen at the second position. This will be called as deoxyribose sugar. That's present in your DNA, and the ribose sugar is present in your RNA. Right? So yeah, that is a brief overview of the carbohydrates, and actually let's talk something about fructose and something about glucose. See, fructose happens to be the sweetest sugar that are present naturally. This is the sweetest sugar that is present naturally. It's also called as fruit sugar because it is present in almost all the fruits except grapes. It's not found in grapes. Okay, fructose is also present in the nectar and the honey. Okay, it's present in all the sugars, I mean in all the fruits that you will come across except the grapes. It's also present in nectar as well as the honey. Right? All right, now let's talk about glucose. One more point that could be discussed with respect to fructose is it is levorotatory. Okay, it is called as levulose because it is levorotatory in nature. Levorotatory in nature. Now let's talk about glucose. Glucose happens to be a sugar that is very common. It's found in our blood as well, and henceforth it is referred to as blood sugar. Okay, and glucose is a common respiratory substrate. It's a common respiratory substrate. In fact, it is found in all. It can be a product of metabolic pathway, can serve as substrate, can serve as a final product. Okay, so that's a common respiratory substrate and yields a decent amount of energy when respired. It's also called as grape sugar, as it's found in the grapes also. Right? Now, this sugar is called as glucose, is referred to as dextrose also. Say, fructose being levorotatory was referred to as levulose. So glucose, if at all it is called as dextrose, what should it mean? It should mean that it is dextrorotatory. It is dextrorotatory. So that is it in this video. In the next video, we will be talking about the derived monosaccharides, which will again be a part of the small carbohydrates. Okay, so monosaccharides is done here. Let's have a brief recap of what we studied in this class today. We studied about the class of biomolecule called as carbohydrates, whereby we discussed that these are the organic compounds which have carbon, hydrogen and oxygen in them. We understood that the carbohydrates are polyhydroxyaldoses and ketose and condensation products. Some of the examples of the aldose and the ketose product sugars were discussed. Then we took into consideration the carbohydrates can be divided into two different classes, smaller and the complex class of carbohydrate. The smaller ones are the soluble one and have a low molecular weight, and because they are sweet in nature, they're also referred to as sugar. The complex ones will be formed because of this smaller one upon the condensation and the binding of these smaller sugars with one another. Product would be formed that would be called as polysaccharides. But in this video, the major emphasis was laid on the monosaccharides. We discussed about different classes of the monosaccharides: triose, tetrose, pentose, hexose, and heptose. Also, their examples were discussed. Then we talked about the fact that the pentose and the hexose can occur in two different forms. They can be present in the open as well as in the closed form, that is a linear and the ring structure. The ring structure can form pentagon and a hexagon structure. The pentagon ones are called as furanose, and the pyranose are the ones which form hexagonal structure. Okay, then these hexagon and the pentagon, that is pyranose and furanose respectively, can occur in two different forms, that is alpha and the beta form of the sugar. In the alpha form, the hydroxyl group is present below the carbon, and in the beta form, the hydroxyl group is present above the carbon, that is present near the oxygen. Okay, and also we discussed some facts and points about fructose and glucose. So that is it in this video. In the next video, we will be discussing about the derived monosaccharides, and till then I would want you to take a very good care of yourself and study hard. And till then, take a very good care of yourself. Yeah, bye.